Early period, before 1776. The history of America begins thousands of years ago, when the first indigenous peoples settled on the continent. These peoples developed numerous cultures and civilizations, including the Iroquois, Navajo, Maya, Inca, and many others. Native American cultures were diverse, with their own traditions, art, religion, and ways of life. European colonization began in the late 15th century when Christopher Columbus discovered America in 1492. The first Europeans to settle in what would become the United States were the Spanish, who established settlements in Florida and the Southwest. By the early 17th century, the English, Dutch, and French began founding colonies along the eastern coast. The English established the first permanent settlement in Jamestown, Virginia, in 1607. 17th to 18th centuries, English colonies and the fight for independence. In the 17th century, the English began to establish colonies in the East, including Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Pennsylvania. Many of these colonies saw economic prosperity and religious freedom. For example, the Puritans, who founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony, aimed to create a Christian society based on their beliefs. Throughout the 18th century, the population of the colonies grew, and the British Crown increasingly sought to control them by introducing new taxes and laws. This led to growing discontent among the colonists, who had no representation in the British Parliament and could not influence decisions. Key events in this period included the Boston Tea Party of 1773, when colonists protested the tea tax, and events that led to the start of the American Revolution. The American Revolution, 1775 to 1783. The American Revolution began in 1775 when the colonies declared war on Great Britain. Leaders of the colonies, such as George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Benjamin Franklin, sought to gain independence from the British Crown. The conflict lasted until 1783, when the Treaty of Paris was signed, and Great Britain recognized the independence of the United States. Following the war, a Congress was formed, and in 1776, the Declaration of Independence was adopted, officially declaring the 13 colonies independent from Britain. However, the newly formed nation still lacked a stable political system. Initially, the United States operated under the Articles of Confederation, but these laws proved too weak to provide an effective government. The Constitution and Expansion, 1787 to 1861. In 1787, a constitutional convention was convened, resulting in the creation of the new Constitution of the United States, which came into force in 1789 and laid the foundation for the federal system of government and the separation of powers between the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. George Washington became the first president of the United States. During the 19th century, the United States experienced significant growth and expansion. Beginning in the early 1800s, the country actively acquired new territories. In 1803, the Louisiana Territory was purchased from France, doubling the size of the country. Throughout this period, the U.S. expanded westward, annexing land that had previously belonged to Native Americans. In the 1846 to 1848 Mexican-American War, the U.S. gained California and other southwestern territories. Meanwhile, Americans began settling the West, often leading to violent conflicts with Native Americans. The Civil War and Reconstruction, 1861 to 1877. By the mid-19th century, tensions between the northern and southern states were mounting, particularly over the issue of slavery. The North, which had an industrial economy, sought to abolish slavery, while the South relied on it for agricultural production, especially on cotton plantations. These tensions led to the Civil War, 1861 to 1865, when 11 Southern states seceded from the Union and formed the Confederacy. The war was brutal, and by its end in 1865, following the Union's victory, slavery was abolished. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution formally ended slavery, and the 14th Amendment granted citizenship and equal rights to former slaves. After the war, the Southern states went through a period of Reconstruction, during which the U.S. government attempted to reintegrate the South into the Union and ensure civil rights for African Americans. The 20th century, 2 world wars and economic change. At the beginning of the 20th century, the United States had become an economic powerhouse, experiencing significant changes due to industrialization and urbanization. In 1917, the U.S. entered World War I, marking a significant step in the country's rise to global influence. In the 1920s and 1930s, the U.S. faced the Great Depression, which had global repercussions. In response to the economic crisis, the government, under President Franklin D. Roosevelt, implemented the New Deal, a series of programs designed to provide relief, create jobs, and regulate the economy. However, by 1941, the U.S. entered World War II after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. The Cold War and global influence. After World War II, the U.S. emerged as one of the two superpowers, alongside the Soviet Union, leading to the Cold War that lasted for several decades. During this tense period, the U.S. was involved in numerous conflicts, such as the Vietnam War and the Korean War, as well as in political and ideological struggles for global influence. In the 1960s and 1970s, the U.S. underwent significant social and cultural changes. The civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, and the counterculture of the 1960s were key themes of this period. Protests against the Vietnam War and demands for social reforms shaped the political climate. Modern history. By the end of the 20th century, the United States had become a global leader in political, economic, and cultural spheres. It played a central role in international affairs, intervening in global conflicts and leading the development of new technologies, particularly in the IT sector. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the U.S. stood as the sole superpower, but in the 21st century, it faced new challenges, including terrorism, particularly following the September 11, 2001 attacks, and economic crises such as the global financial crisis of 2008.